Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and today I wanted to go through all of the new arena weapons that come from Vatashran Hollows and give some feedback on them. This assessment is based on my initial impressions as well as some discussion from within the community. Just a heads up, this will be mostly from a PvE perspective, as my PvP experience over the last few patches or so has been pretty limited. And a quick shout out to esoskillbook.com for all of the skill tooltips that will be shown. It's a great website to get up-to-date info on any skill in the game. Alright, let's go ahead and get right into it. I'll go ahead and start with the one that has probably been the most generally well received, and that is Force Overflow. This affects the Restoration Staff ability Force Siphon. This ability is not very popular right now in PvE, as you can get lifesteal on everything in the area with the skill Blood Altar, and that skill also provides a really nice synergy for the group. For Force Siphon's morphs, one of them gives Minor Expedition, which is not really necessary in most PvE content, and the other one gives Minor Magicka Steal, which is generally already kept up with Elemental Drain, a skill that also provides Major Breach. I just wanted to give a little background on the skill there and show why it currently isn't super popular in PvE. Alright, so what does this set do? Casting Force Siphon on a target within 15 meters of you causes a surge of magical energy to tether between you for 10 seconds. While the tether persists and you remain in range, you and group members in the tether restore 175 magicka and stamina every 1 second. This effect can occur every 10 seconds. And then for the perfected version, you also get a bonus 877 maximum magicka. So what's good about this set? It gives more of a reason to run an uncommonly used skill. The regen it gives for the group is a pretty nice amount and will definitely be noticeable in trials or dungeons. It gives both stamina and magicka, so if you're running a mixed composition, it will benefit both styles of DPS. The theme of what the arena weapon does lines up with the theme of the skill. If you look at the skill, it's based around returning resources. One of those morphs gives both health and magicka. This further adds to that siphoning theme and creates a tether that generates even more resources for the group. It's easy to use and it's on a free ability. You just need to cast it once every 10 seconds to keep it up 100% of the time. And the perfected version gives a magicka bonus, which will be useful for someone using this set. I think either magicka or magicka recovery would work here. This extra bonus is fine. I'll get into themes a little bit more throughout this, but I think this is one of the weapons that does a good job fitting the theme of the skill and the skill line. Alright, so what's not so good? You do have to be pretty close to the tether to get the resources. I think it's about 4 meters in width total, which I think honestly is pretty fair with the amount of resources it returns. It rewards groups for stacking together tightly and rewards the healer for positioning the tether correctly on the group. Honestly, not too many negatives I can think of. It's a well-designed set in my opinion, and the art team did a really nice job with it too. I don't really have any suggestions for improvements on this one. I think it's overall in a pretty good spot. Alright, next up we have Point Blank Snipe. This, as you could probably tell, affects the ability Snipe and its morphs. So what does it do? It increases your damage done with Snipe by 33% against targets that are within 7 meters of you. And then the perfected version also adds 103 weapon damage. So what's good about this set? The damage increase is pretty significant. 33% is a lot for a hard-hitting ability like Snipe. And it does seem comparable to the extra damage you'd get from something like a monster set, especially if your rotation allows for a lot of sniping. The perfected bonus is nice as well. Weapon damage is always welcome on a set that will be a front bar set in most cases. So what's not so good? I'll start off talking about the theme. The theme doesn't really fit with the bow. The bow is traditionally used as a long-range weapon, and I respect the creativity in the name and trying to do something to defy that, but the bow has a built-in passive that causes you to deal more damage with your bow abilities the further out you are. This creates a weird interaction with Snipe in this set where the closer you move in from max range, the lower your damage gets up until that point where you hit the 7 meter range, and then bam, your damage shoots back up and you are dealing maximum Snipe damage. However, all of your other bow abilities will be dealing less damage at that range, so in order to benefit from the Snipe bonus, you lose damage from your other bow abilities. So how can we improve it? Aside from completely reworking it into another bonus, here are some thoughts I've seen on it. We could have Snipe receive a 20 to 25% damage boost at 7 meters and closer instead of 33%, but have the 12% long shot passive always active for Snipe. So then there are just 2 snipe damage values you could encounter, one outside of 7 meters and one at 7 meters or less. This way, even outside of the 7 meters, you would still do more damage with snipe than you normally would, since you'd be benefiting from the full range passive even when you aren't at full range. So it isn't a complete loss and a 0 boost if you do step slightly outside of that 7 meter point. This also still brings it to around that 33% boost when you're inside of 7 meters, but doesn't diminish in damage when you get in closer than that. I've also seen the suggestion to remove the current bonus and instead have it apply a stacking snipe debuff. Could be somewhere between 5 to 8 stacks or so that last 5 seconds each, but refresh on each use of snipe, where the higher number of debuff stacks, the more increased damage that snipe deals. This wouldn't be a point blank theme, so it would need a name change, but it does fit in with the use of the ability. It would reward the player for successfully landing multiple snipes and punishes those that don't react to the sniping and let themselves continue to be hit. It will also reward a tight rotation in PvE for not letting your snipe debuff stacks fall off. Overall, the set bonus isn't awful and could see some niche use, but I really dislike how it currently clashes against the long shot passive. Those are some thoughts I've seen that seem to fit in a little better with the overall theme of the bow. Next up, we have Wrath of Elements. This affects the ability Weakness to Elements, or the popularly used morph Elemental Drain. So what does this set do? Casting Weakness to Elements on a target within 15 meters of you causes a surge of elemental energy to tether between you for 10 seconds. While the tether persists and you remain in range, enemies touching the tether take 2140 flame, shock, or frost damage every 1 second. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. This is probably the one that I've seen the most criticism on so far, but I'll go ahead and start with a couple of positives. It does come from a free ability, so it costs nothing to cast, and it is AoE, and since it's elemental damage, has a chance to proc secondary effects. And now we'll go through the negatives. The damage on it is way too low. Since it's a proc set and can't crit, the damage output is pitifully low for single target damage and just okay for AoE damage. It also doesn't really fit with the way that the skill is used. The skill in PvE is run by support in 99% of scenarios. Tying a very weak damage proc to it doesn't really fit in with the theme of it. It does fit into the elemental theme, but not the usage. Not to mention that it is often used on targets before the fight begins, and since it doesn't do damage, it doesn't initiate combat. This takes that use away. Also, the randomness of the elements eliminates it from providing reliable uptime on the elemental catalyst set. If it rotated through the elements in a set order, it would be a nice niche way to keep that setup on a support role. Alright, so what can we do to make this set better? I received more suggestions for this one than any of the others, and here are a couple that stood out the most. The first thing that could be done is add in an actual weakness to elements. Casting it could make the target weaker to frost, flame, and shock by X percentage while the tether holds. This would give this weapon a use that fits in more with the ability's use as a debuff ability. The debuff value could be set at a point where it could be coupled with the damage that is already there, or the damage could be removed to allow for it to be a little higher and it goes back to being solely for debuffing. If this route was chosen, a unique interaction could be for this weakness to the 3 elements to ramp up over time, so it would reward keeping the tether intact for the full 10 seconds. So maybe at 1 second, the target is 1% weaker to frost, flame, and shock, and by the time it gets to 10 seconds, the target would be 10% weaker to those elements. Then the user would have to reapply and start over. Another option I liked is that if you want to keep it as a damaging ability, it needs to do more damage. So one solution would be to have the damage ramp up the longer it's tethered. This would reward players for keeping the tether intact and punish players that are unable to, or players that are on the receiving end of it in PvP and don't break the line of sight. This could make it a viable DPS option if the values were tweaked and would essentially be like an AoE Zon. It would take longer to ramp up since it's 10 seconds, so more likely to be interrupted before max damage than Zon, but would have a higher and more controllable uptime since it would be tied to a skill and not a proc chance. And it does cost a GCD every 10 seconds to activate, so that should also be considered when compared to a free chance damage proc like Zon. Overall, I think this one probably misses the mark more than any of the other arena sets in its current form. The visual look of it and the idea of a tether of elements is cool, but it needs a lot of work before I can see it being used in PvE content. Alright, next up we have Executioner's Blade. This affects the skill Hidden Blade. This is probably the least popular of the dual wield skills to run for PvE purposes, though it is nice for easy dungeon runs since you get major brutality and you don't have to run potions. So this set causes Hidden Blade to deal 200% more damage to targets under 25% health when you are standing behind them, and the perfected version also adds 666 weapon crit. So let's look at the positives. It is another execute option for classes that don't have one built in, and the Shrouded Daggers morph is AoE, so it's another AoE execute option on top of Whirling Blades. And now for the negatives. It doesn't kick in until 25%, so essentially a wasted 2-piece for 75% of the fight. It does require being positioned behind the target, which is not possible on many fights. The Flying Blade morph does much less damage than Shrouded Daggers, so it's not going to be used in PvE and possibly only for PvP, maybe just for chasing someone down who is at low health and running away from you and trying to finish them off. The tooltip seems like it should do decent damage in execute, but when comparing it to a skill like Killer's Blade, I was getting consistently lower from it in parses. It's also incredibly expensive. Trying to use it on the trial dummy, I'd go from hovering near full stamina at the beginning of execute to having to heavy attack a couple of times because I was completely out. It's pretty crazy just how quickly it can sap your resources. Alright, so what can we do to make it better? I think to start off with, the damage simply needs to be much higher, somewhere between 300 and 400%. It's not enough to simply make it an execute ability, since you are giving up another 2-piece, most likely a monster helm to run this, a monster helm that will be active the whole fight. It needs to not just be an execute, but a really strong execute. You're giving up 75% of your fight to run this. It needs to add in cost reduction as well. If this is going to possibly go on classes that don't have an execute, it needs to actually be sustainable. I realize the AoE part of it has to be a factor in cost and damage, but it can only bounce 3 times, so it is limited in the amount of AoE it can do compared to a skill like Whirling Blades. I'd also like to see the standing behind condition removed. It's already not usable for 75% of the fight. Why add in another condition to make it even harder to use? Another idea I thought was pretty cool is to swap the bonus with the Asylum dual wield bonus. So the Asylum bonus is, when you cast Whirlwind, you envelop yourself in a destructive flurry of blades for 6 seconds that pulse outward, striking up to 3 random enemies within a 5-meter radius every 1 second for 2675 physical damage. This can occur once every 10 seconds. I won't get too much into the specific damage numbers on this set, but I think they are pretty underwhelming as well. You don't see this set used a lot, and it's because the damage, once again, can't crit and just doesn't do a whole lot for you. But I can see a skill like Shrouded Daggers pairing really well with this set bonus if it was properly adjusted, and then the skill Whirlwind pairing really well with the set bonus we just went over for the new arena set. This would make Whirlwind a much more potent execute and give Shrouded Daggers even more AoE damage. The numbers might have to be tweaked a little bit with Whirlwind since it already ramps up in damage, but it would make sense since it's already an execute skill. Overall, I don't feel like the power of this set was designed with it not working for 75% of the fight in mind. Even in PvP, having to hit someone under 25% can be difficult, and even then you'd have to be behind them as well. I just don't see this set being too good in its current form and would love to see some buffs to it before it goes live. Our next skill up is Frenzied Momentum. This affects the skill Momentum and its morphs. Momentum is a pretty popular PvP skill, but similarly to Shrouded Daggers, you don't see it much in PvE other than builds that are trying to get major brutality without using potions. So what does this set do? While Momentum is active, casting stamina abilities generates a stack of Frenzied Momentum for 10 seconds, up to 5 times. Upon reaching max stacks, your next heavy attack will consume all stacks and release a violent explosion of energy around your target, dealing 9,028 physical damage to them and all enemies within 8 meters of them. So let's go through the positives. This doesn't require a fully charged heavy attack, so it can be lined up with burst more easily using a quick medium attack. And the perfected stamina bonus is fine. Nothing flashy here, but it will still support playstyles using this. And for the negatives, the damage proc seems to be pretty low for something that takes casting 5 skills to build up. It is possible to activate it every 5 seconds if you're utilizing the global cooldown system as quickly as possible, but realistically, it's probably more like every 6 to 7 seconds in actual combat. And this is if you're only casting stamina abilities, so that time increases if you're using magicka abilities as well. Comparing that damage to the tooltip on something like Calorian or Red Mountain, and it just seems kind of lacking for how much more effort is required. The 10-second timer will lead to frustration when using in PvP, so if the damage is left alone, I don't think there should be a timer on it at all. Let people pre-buff with it if they want and hold on to it. It's not doing some insane damage value. If it is the AoE component that's holding it back from being higher in damage, let it be single target. There are already plenty of two-handed weapons that work in AoE. My own personal preference would be to remove the heavy attack requirement and tie it to a bash instead. I know some people don't mind heavies or mediums, but I prefer the flow of light attacks and using bashes to proc conditions, or maybe even the possibility of the requirement being a heavy or a bash to include both of those. I know this is my personal preference, but it would be nice to not be forced into using a heavy attack. I don't see this set getting much use at all for PvE in its current state, as the damage is just too low to justify it, and I don't think it's too appealing for PvP either, as it seems like a little too much effort for not enough damage. I would love to see this get adjusted further before it goes live as well, to either higher single target damage or something completely different that fits more in line with buffing and healing, which is what the skill is used for. I think something cool that could be done to time with the theme is that every second that it's active, you gain 30 weapon damage. Up to the 20-second mark, it'll cap out at 600 weapon damage, and then as soon as the skill runs out or you refresh it, it starts over again. This would be an average of about 300 weapon damage added for PvE scenarios, and then for PvP would allow players to line up their burst with the last few seconds of the skill to get the maximum impact. It'd also make you think a little harder about using it early for the heal or the snare immunity, and try to hold on to it possibly for a few seconds longer to get a little more damage and start your burst combo. I don't know if that 30 weapon damage a second would be the right mark. It might need to be a little bit higher for it to be worth it, since you would just have a brief window to use it, but something along those lines I think would be really interesting and really tie in with the theme of the skill. Alright, and finally, let's take a look at Void Bash. This affects the one hand and shield skill, Power Bash. This skill is usually more of a PvP skill, as it stuns with one morph, or with the other morph is used as a spammable that stacks damage while blocking and really isn't used by PvE tanks. This arena set is another good example of making a skill more enticing for PvE content. So what does it do? When you deal damage with Power Bash, you apply Call of the Void to yourself for 2 seconds. Enemies within 12 meters are immediately pulled to you. After Call of the Void ends, you apply Major Maim to enemies in the area for 10 seconds. This effect can occur once every 13 seconds. And then the perfected bonus is 965 max health. So what's good about this set? It gives tanks an instant AoE chain that pulls all pullable targets in. It also puts the debuff Major Maim on all targets within the area, even if they weren't chained in. I'm glad the Maim still works on targets that aren't pulled, because there are a lot of enemies in PvE that can't be pulled. Major Maim, even though only 10% now instead of 30, is still not a super easy debuff to come by. Another positive is that the debuff lasts 10 seconds. I think that's a pretty decent length to be attached to a skill. Any lower and it would start to be a pain to keep it up. And then finally, I think it fits in well with the theme of sword and shield. The tank is there to corral the enemies and to debuff them. This doesn't have some strange effect that goes against what the tank is already trying to accomplish. So what's not so good? The 13-second cooldown. Major Maim is no longer 30%, but only 10%, so having a 13-second cooldown seems a tiny bit too long. This is especially long and punishing if you happen to miss your target that you're initially trying to hit with that debuff. I don't think it would be unreasonable to have the cooldown be tied to the 10-second debuff length, given the short range, which leads us to the next negative, the 12-meter range. 12 meters isn't tiny, but it's not very large either. I see why having a long range like 28 meters would be way too much, especially in PvP, but maybe somewhere in the 15 to 18 meter range would work better for most PvE scenarios, if all of the other bonuses were to remain the same. All in all, you'll have to give up a monster set or another arena set or the ease of double barring a set in order to run this. And I think in its current state, it probably still has a place in PvE, but I could see some of the values on it being a little bit better and it still not being overpowered. Either lower the cooldown, raise the length the debuff lasts, or lengthen the range, and I think it'd be in a really great spot. Overall, I really do like this weapon set and its design. I just think it could use some slight tweaks. Alright, those are all of the new arena weapons. I mainly made this because I think all of us want to see something new and fun and powerful when these arena sets come out, because we only get one of them for each skill, and so whenever new ones come out, we want to see really cool, game-changing items. I think sometimes the developers are a little scared to make something too powerful, and in turn kind of take the fun out of the items. So we end up getting something that everyone's initial reaction is just kind of meh. Let's make these into something that really excites the player base. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Do you like them? Did I misjudge one of these weapons and miss something great about it? Hopefully we can get these to a little better spot before they go live. As always, thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.